Welcome back to History for Sleep, where we drift through the deep past, one story at a time. Tonight, we're going on a slow, soothing journey into one of the most profound mysteries of human existence. For 200,000 years, our entire species lived on a single continent. Every human who ever lived, loved, dreamed, and died did so within the boundaries of Africa. And then something changed, something freed us. Tonight we'll explore what kept humanity confined for so long, and what finally set us free to inherit the Earth. As always, I hope this video helps you drift off gently, or at least helps you put your worries into perspective by zooming out a few 100,000 years. Of course, there's a small risk that it might be too interesting and keep you awake. But if that happens, well, at least you'll have learned something fascinating along the way. Before we float off into the past together, I'd love it if you gave this video a like and maybe even subscribed if you haven't already. It really helps this sleepy little channel grow. I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. It's always such a joy to see our sleepy history community scattered gently across the globe. Now, settle in. Get comfortable. You don't need to remember any of this. You don't need to take notes or stay alert. Just let the words wash over you like whispers on the wind. And as we begin this gentle voyage into the vast unknown, remember this video is for educational and relaxation purposes only, and is not intended as medical advice. Ready? Let's begin. Picture this. The year is 200,000 BCE. The number itself is almost impossible to truly comprehend. If you counted 1 year per second, it would take you over 2 days of continuous counting just to reach that far back. But numbers don't really capture the feeling of deep time. Instead, imagine generations. Your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents. Now imagine that chain of ancestors stretching back, hand to hand, parent to child, an unbroken line reaching into the mist of time. If you could see them all standing in a line, each person holding the hand of their parent and their child, that line would stretch for thousands of miles. And at the very end of that line, in a world so different from ours it might as well be another planet, stands a woman or a man who looks remarkably like you. This ancient Africa was not the Africa we know today. The Sahara, that vast ocean of sand that now separates North Africa from the rest of the continent, was then a green savanna dotted with lakes and rivers. Hippos wallowed in waters where today only sand dunes exist. The coastlines were different too. During ice ages, when so much of the world's water was locked in glaciers, the sea level dropped by hundreds of feet, revealing vast plains that are now beneath the waves. Islands that we know today were hills on these coastal plains. The Red Sea, that narrow ribbon of water between Africa and Arabia, sometimes nearly disappeared, leaving only scattered salt lakes in a valley that animals and perhaps humans could cross on foot. The climate swung like a vast pendulum, oscillating between warm, wet periods and cool, dry ones. These weren't gentle transitions measured in centuries, but dramatic shifts that could transform entire ecosystems within a few human lifetimes. A child might be born in a forest and die in a grassland, having watched the trees retreat year by year as the rains failed. These climate swings were driven by subtle changes in Earth's orbit, tiny wobbles in our planet's spin that nevertheless had profound effects on where the rains fell and where life could flourish. In this ever-changing landscape lived creatures that seem almost mythical to us now. Giant buffalo with horns spanning 6 feet roamed the grasslands. Massive elephants, larger than any living today, moved in herds across the savannah. There were giant baboons the size of gorillas and saber-toothed cats that could bring down prey many times their size. The nights echoed with sounds we'll never hear again. The rumble of giant ground sloths, the trumpeting of straight-tusked elephants, the roar of cave lions larger than any lion alive today. This was not a world made for humans. We were newcomers, interlopers, in an ancient drama that had been playing out for millions of years. And yet, in this world of giants and monsters, something extraordinary was happening. In the eastern and southern reaches of Africa, a new kind of primate was emerging. They walked fully upright, their hands free to make and carry tools. Their brains, while not yet as large as ours, were growing, expanding, developing new capabilities with each passing millennium. These were our ancestors, though they didn't know it. They couldn't have imagined that their descendants would one day walk on the moon, compose symphonies, or lie in bed listening to stories about them on devices that would seem like magic, even to people living just a century ago. The archaeological record from this time is frustratingly sparse. Bones don't preserve well in the African climate, and most of what our ancestors left behind has long since crumbled to dust. But occasionally, by pure chance, conditions align perfectly to preserve a moment in time. A body falls into a cave and is quickly covered by sediment. A footprint in volcanic ash is preserved by a gentle rain that turns it to stone. A tool is dropped in a spring where minerals replace its organic components, turning wood to rock while preserving every detail of its manufacture. These are the whispers from the past, the faint echoes of lives lived so long ago that time itself seems to lose meaning. From these whispers, we've learned that by 200,000 years ago, anatomically, modern humans had appeared. The oldest fossils that are undeniably Homo sapiens come from sites in Morocco, Ethiopia, and South Africa. The Jebel Ahud fossils from Morocco, dated to around 300,000 years ago, show faces that wouldn't look out of place in a modern crowd, though their brain cases were still slightly elongated compared to ours. The Homo kibish fossils from Ethiopia, around 195,000 years old, are even more modern in appearance. These were people like us in body, though their minds, their thoughts, their inner worlds remain a mystery. What did they think about as they watched the sun set over the African savanna? Did they wonder about the lights in the sky? Did they tell stories about how the world came to be? Did they mourn their dead with the same intensity we do? We can never truly know, but we can see hints in what they left behind. By 200,000 years ago, they were making complex tools, not just simple sharp stones, but carefully crafted implements designed for specific purposes. They had spear points for hunting, scrapers for working hides, awls for piercing, and blades for cutting. The technology required to make these tools suggest planning, foresight, and the ability to hold a complex sequence of actions in mind. But perhaps most remarkably, they were beginning to use symbols. At Blombus Cave in South Africa, archaeologists have found pieces of ochre, a red mineral pigment, that were carved with geometric patterns around 75,000 years ago. These patterns, crosshatches, and parallel lines serve no practical purpose. They're art, or at least decoration, the first tentative steps towards symbolic thinking. Someone sat in that cave, perhaps while rain fell outside, or while waiting for hunters to return, and carefully carved those lines. They were creating something that had meaning beyond its physical form, a symbol that communicated something to others who shared their culture. This is one of the great mysteries of human evolution. When did we become truly human in our minds? The archaeological record suggests it wasn't a sudden transformation, but a gradual awakening that took place over tens of thousands of years. The earliest anatomically modern humans, those living 200,000 years ago, had bodies like ours, but may have had minds that were subtly different. They were intelligent, certainly, capable of surviving in challenging environments and making complex tools. But did they have language as we know it? Did they tell elaborate stories, create myths, imagine gods and spirits? The evidence suggests that these capabilities emerged gradually, reaching full flower, perhaps around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, in what some scientists call the cognitive revolution. During this long period of development, humanity remained confined to Africa. This is one of the most puzzling aspects of our early history. Other human species had left Africa long before us. Homo erectus had spread across Asia nearly 2 million years ago. Neanderthals had colonized Europe hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans appeared. Yet we, despite our larger brains and more sophisticated technology, remained in our African cradle for what seems like an eternity. Generation after generation lived and died without ever venturing beyond the boundaries of their home continent. The reasons for this confinement are complex and still debated by scientists. One major barrier was the Sahara Desert. Today, the Sahara is the world's largest hot desert, a seemingly impassable barrier of sand and rock stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. But the Sahara hasn't always been a desert. It goes through cycles, sometimes green and welcoming, sometimes dry and forbidding. These cycles are driven by changes in Earth's orbit that affect the strength and position of the African monsoon. When the monsoon is strong, it brings rain to the Sahara, transforming it into a grassland dotted with lakes. When it's weak, the region becomes the desert we know today. For much of the time that early humans lived in Africa, the Sahara was in one of its dry phases. It would have been an almost insurmountable barrier, a wall of heat and sand that few could cross and survive. The few routes out of Africa, along the Nile River Valley or across the southern end of the Red Sea, were narrow corridors that might have been blocked by other human species or by environmental conditions that made passage difficult or impossible. Neanderthals and Denisovans, our cousin species who had left Africa earlier, already occupied much of Eurasia. They were well adapted to their environments, knew the local resources, and would have been formidable competition for any modern humans trying to establish themselves in new territories. But perhaps the most important factor keeping humans in Africa wasn't external, but internal. The early modern humans of 200,000 years ago, despite their modern appearance, may not have had the full cognitive toolkit that would later enable our species to adapt to radically different environments. Language, that invisible technology that allows us to share complex information and coordinate large groups, may still have been developing. The ability to create and maintain complex cultural traditions, to pass down accumulated knowledge through generations, may not yet have reached the critical threshold needed for successful expansion into new and challenging environments. Consider what it takes to survive in a completely new environment. You need to know which plants are edible and which are poisonous. You need to understand the behavior of unfamiliar animals, know where to find water in different seasons, how to make shelter from local materials, how to find or make appropriate clothing for new climates. This knowledge can't be gained quickly through trial and error, not without tremendous cost in human lives. It requires the ability to learn from others, to preserve and transmit information across generations, to build on the discoveries of those who came before. This is culture in its deepest sense, not just art and music, but the entire body of knowledge and practice that allows a group to survive and thrive. The archaeological record suggests that this kind of complex culture was still developing during humanity's long confinement in Africa. The tools from 200,000 years ago, while sophisticated, don't show the rapid innovation and regional variation that appears later. There's little evidence for trade networks or long-distance exchange of materials. Symbolic behavior, while present, was sporadic and limited. It's as if humanity was in a kind of cognitive chrysalis, slowly developing the mental and cultural capabilities that would eventually enable us to inherit the Earth. This is not to say that life was static, or that no progress was made. Throughout this period, we see gradual improvements in tool technology. The simple hand axes of earlier periods gave way to more sophisticated toolkits, with specialized implements for different tasks. Points became finer and more carefully crafted. New techniques for working stone were developed, allowing for the creation of longer, sharper blades. These changes happened slowly, over thousands of years, but they represent real innovation and adaptation. We also see the beginnings of what we might call modern behavior appearing sporadically throughout this period. At Pinnacle Point on the South African coast, people were harvesting shellfish and using red ochre pigment 164,000 years ago. They were also heat-treating stones to make them easier to work, a sophisticated technique that requires careful control of fire and an understanding of how heat changes the properties of rock. At other sites, we find evidence of people using adhesives to attach stone points to wooden shafts, creating composite tools that required planning and complex recipes involving multiple ingredients. These innovations didn't appear everywhere at once. They flickered into existence in one place, perhaps persisted for a few generations, then disappeared, only to reappear somewhere else thousands of years later. It's as if humanity was experimenting, trying out new ways of doing things, but hadn't yet developed the cultural mechanisms to ensure that innovations were preserved and spread. A clever individual might discover a new technique, teach it to their children, but if those children died without passing it on, the innovation would be lost perhaps for millennia. This pattern of innovation and loss might help explain why humanity remained in Africa for so long. Without robust cultural transmission, each group had to rediscover crucial survival techniques for themselves. Expansion into new environments would have been extremely risky, without the accumulated knowledge of generations to draw upon. It was safer to stay in familiar territories, where the resources were known and the dangers understood. The population of humans during this period was also surprisingly small. Genetic studies suggest that the effective population size, the number of individuals contributing to the gene pool, may have been as low as 10,000 people for much of our early history. This doesn't mean there were only 10,000 humans alive, but it does suggest that the total population was small and scattered. Small populations are vulnerable to local extinctions. A drought, a disease outbreak, or conflict with neighboring groups could wipe out entire communities. Knowledge and innovations could disappear with them. These small, scattered populations lived in a world that was both paradise and prison. Africa, with its incredible diversity of environments, provided everything humans needed to survive. From the tropical forests of Central Africa to the Mediterranean climates of the north and south, from the high mountains of Ethiopia to the vast savannas of the east, the continent offered a variety of habitats and resources. There were plants to gather, animals to hunt, materials for tools and shelter. The climate, while variable, was generally warmer than much of Eurasia, requiring less in the way of specialized clothing and shelter. But this very abundance may have been a trap. Why risk everything on a dangerous journey into the unknown when everything you need is available where you are? The push to explore, to seek new horizons, often comes from necessity rather than curiosity. If resources are adequate and populations are stable, there's little incentive to venture into potentially hostile new territories. Africa was large enough and diverse enough to absorb population growth and provide new territories for expansion, without requiring humans to leave the continent. Yet something was building during these long millennia of confinement. With each generation, the genetic and cultural foundations of modern human behavior were being laid. Mutations that enhanced cognitive abilities were spreading through the population. Cultural innovations, even if lost and rediscovered multiple times, were gradually becoming more common and more sophisticated. The human brain, already large by 200,000 years ago, was being fine-tuned by natural selection and cultural evolution. Neural pathways that supported language, abstract thinking, and social cooperation were being reinforced and refined. We can see hints of this cognitive evolution in the shape of the skull itself. Early modern human skulls, while similar to ours, show subtle differences. The brain case becomes more globular over time, suggesting changes in the relative size of different brain regions. The areas associated with language and complex planning appear to expand. These changes are small, measured in millimeters, but they may reflect profound changes in cognitive abilities. The social world of these early humans was also evolving. Living in groups requires sophisticated social intelligence. You need to remember who helped you and who betrayed you, who can be trusted and who cannot. You need to navigate complex relationships, form alliances, resolve conflicts without destroying the group's cohesion. These social challenges may have been one of the primary drivers of human cognitive evolution. The ability to understand others' intentions, to predict their behaviour, to manipulate and cooperate would have been strongly selected for in the complex social world of early human groups. Language, that unique human ability that allows us to share our thoughts with others, was likely developing throughout this period. We can't know exactly when full language emerged, as it leaves no direct archaeological trace. But we can make educated guesses based on indirect evidence. The production of symbolic artifacts like the engraved ochres from Blombos Cave suggests that by 75,000 years ago, humans had at least some capacity for symbolic thinking, a prerequisite for language. The increasing complexity of tool-making traditions suggests the ability to transmit complex information between individuals. The successful colonization of diverse environments that would come later required the kind of detailed information sharing that only language makes possible. Some scientists have suggested that a genetic mutation affecting language abilities may have occurred around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, triggering the cognitive revolution that enabled humans to finally leave Africa. The FOXP2 gene, sometimes called the language gene, shows signs of strong selection in the human lineage. While this gene is not solely responsible for language, mutations affecting it can cause severe speech and language disorders. The human version of FOXP2 differs from the chimpanzee version by only 2 amino acids, but these small changes may have had profound effects on our ability to produce and understand speech. But genes alone don't tell the whole story. Culture and biology interact in complex ways. A genetic change that slightly improved vocal control or auditory processing might have made possible new forms of communication. These new forms of communication could then create selection pressure for further genetic changes that enhance these abilities. Over thousands of years, this feedback loop between genes and culture could have produced the remarkable language abilities that characterize our species. As we contemplate these long millennia of African confinement, it's worth remembering that this wasn't a period of stagnation, but of preparation. Like a runner crouching at the starting line, gathering energy for the race ahead, humanity was developing the tools, both physical and mental, that would eventually enable our species to spread across the globe. Every innovation, even those that were lost and had to be rediscovered, added to the sum of human experience. Every generation that successfully passed on its knowledge to the next strengthened the cultural traditions that would become our species' greatest asset. The social bonds that held these early groups together were also being strengthened. Humans are extraordinarily cooperative compared to other primates. We share food, care for each other's children, and work together on tasks that no individual could accomplish alone. This hyper-cooperation didn't emerge overnight. It was built slowly, over thousands of generations, through countless small acts of kindness and reciprocity. The grandmother who shared her knowledge of medicinal plants, the hunter who gave meat to a family whose father was injured, the child who helped care for younger siblings, all were weaving the social fabric that would eventually enable humans to undertake migrations and colonizations that required extraordinary levels of cooperation and coordination. Art and symbolism were also beginning to flourish during this period, though the evidence is fragmentary. Beyond the engraved ochres of Blombos Cave, we find shell beads that were clearly made for decoration rather than utility. At sites across Africa, from Morocco to South Africa, people were piercing shells and stringing them together, creating the world's first jewellery. These beads might seem trivial to us, but they represent something profound. They show that humans were concerned with their appearance, that they wanted to communicate something about themselves to others. Perhaps the beads indicated status, group membership, or personal achievement. Whatever their specific meaning, they show that humans were beginning to live in a symbolic world where objects could carry meaning beyond their physical properties. The use of pigments also became more widespread during this period. Red ochre, in particular, seems to have held special significance for early humans. It's found at sites across Africa, often in contexts that suggest ritual use. bodies were sometimes covered with ochre before burial, suggesting beliefs about death and possibly an afterlife. The colour red itself may have had symbolic significance, perhaps representing blood, life, or transformation. The fact that people went to considerable effort to obtain and process ochre, sometimes travelling long distances to find high-quality sources, shows that it was valued beyond any practical use. Music and dance, those universal human activities that leave almost no archaeological trace, were probably also part of early human life. The capacity for music appears to be hardwired into the human brain. Infants respond to rhythm and melody from birth. Every known human culture has music of some form. It's reasonable to assume that our African ancestors sang and danced, using their voices and bodies to create rhythm and meaning. Perhaps they sang while working, using rhythm to coordinate group activities. Perhaps they danced around fires at night, strengthening social bonds and celebrating successful hunts or the changing seasons. Storytelling, too, must have been part of early human life, even if we can't know the specific stories that were told. The human mind seems designed for narrative. We naturally organize our experiences into stories with beginnings, middles, and ends. We use stories to make sense of the world, to transmit information, and to create shared meaning within groups. Around those ancient African campfires, as the stars wheeled overhead, our ancestors surely told stories. Stories about the hunt, about the ancestors, about how the world came to be. These stories would have been more than entertainment. They were the repository of cultural knowledge, the way important information was preserved and transmitted across generations. The spiritual life of these early humans remains largely mysterious, but there are tantalizing hints that they had begun to develop religious or spiritual beliefs. The careful treatment of the dead at some sites suggests beliefs about what happens after death. The use of ochre in burial contexts might indicate beliefs about transformation or the journey to another world. The creation of symbolic artifacts suggests minds capable of imagining invisible forces and entities. While we can't know the specific content of their beliefs, it seems likely that our ancestors had begun to populate their world with spirits, forces, and meanings that went beyond the merely material. As the millennia passed, the evidence for symbolic behavior becomes stronger and more widespread. By 100,000 years ago, we see clear evidence for personal ornamentation, complex tool-making traditions, and possibly even early forms of art. The pace of cultural change, while still slow by modern standards, was beginning to accelerate. Innovations were appearing more frequently and spreading more widely. The cognitive and cultural foundations for humanity's eventual expansion were being laid, but still humans remained in Africa. The barriers that had confined them for so long remained in place. The Sahara continued its cycles of green and brown, sometimes opening corridors to the north, sometimes closing them. The narrow straits at the southern end of the Red Sea remained a barrier, small enough to see across but large enough to prevent casual crossing. The established populations of other human species in Eurasia remained in place, occupying the ecological niches that modern humans might otherwise have filled. Climate played a crucial role in maintaining this confinement. The period from about 190,000 to 130,000 years ago was marked by an ice age that would have made much of Eurasia even less hospitable than usual. Sea levels were lower, but the exposed land was often cold and dry. The Sahara was in one of its hyper-arid phases, creating an almost impenetrable barrier to northward movement. The few humans who might have managed to cross would have found themselves in environments radically different from anything in their African homeland, facing challenges for which they had no cultural preparation. There may have been failed attempts to leave Africa during this period, groups that ventured north or east only to perish or retreat. The archaeological record preserves only successes, not failures. For every group that successfully established itself in a new territory, there may have been dozens that tried and failed, their stories lost forever. These failures, tragic as they were would have been learning experiences for the species as a whole. Each attempt would have added to the sum of human knowledge about what lay beyond Africa's borders, what challenges awaited, what preparations were necessary. The genetic evidence suggests that there were indeed early excursions out of Africa that didn't lead to permanent settlement. Some genetic studies indicate that modern humans may have interbred with Neanderthals as early as 200,000 years ago, which would have required at least temporary presence outside of Africa. But these early contacts didn't lead to sustained colonization. The humans involved either died out or returned to Africa, their adventures leaving only faint traces in our DNA. It's also worth considering that the concept of leaving Africa would have been meaningless to the people of the time. They didn't know they were in Africa, didn't know there were other continents to explore. They knew their local territories, the lands their parents and grandparents had known. The horizon was not a challenge to be overcome, but a boundary to their known world. Movement, when it occurred, would have been gradual, following resources, fleeing conflicts or environmental changes, not a conscious decision to explore new continents. The social structures of these early human groups would also have influenced their mobility. Most likely they lived in small bands of related individuals, perhaps 25 to 50 people. These bands would have been part of larger tribal networks, connected by kinship, marriage, and reciprocal relationships. Leaving the network meant leaving behind not just familiar territory, but also the social safety net that could mean the difference between life and death in times of hardship. The decision to venture into completely unknown territory, away from all kin and allies, would not have been taken lightly. Yet despite all these barriers, physical and psychological, something was stirring in the human spirit. The same cognitive abilities that made humans cautious about leaving their known world also made them curious about what lay beyond. The capacity for imagination that allowed them to create art and tell stories also allowed them to dream of other places, other possibilities. The social bonds that kept them tied to their groups also enabled the cooperation necessary for successful migration and colonization. As we near the end of this first part of our journey, it's worth pausing to appreciate the profound importance of this long African chapter in human history. For 200,000 years, every human ancestor lived, loved, and died on African soil. Every innovation in tool-making, every artistic expression, every story told around ancient campfires, every prayer offered to unknown gods happened in Africa. The continent was not just the birthplace of humanity, but the crucible in which our species was forged, where the cognitive and cultural tools that would eventually enable us to inherit the earth were developed and refined. This long confinement was not a failure or a delay, but a necessary period of preparation. Like a seed that must gather energy before it can sprout, humanity needed time to develop the biological and cultural capabilities necessary for the great expansion that was to come. The languages that would eventually be spoken from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, the technologies that would allow humans to survive in every environment on Earth, the social structures that would enable cooperation on unprecedented scales, all had their origins in this long African incubation. The genetic diversity that exists within Africa today is greater than in the rest of the world combined, a testament to the deep history of human populations on the continent. Every non-African human alive today is descended from a small group of pioneers who left Africa perhaps 70,000 years ago. But the majority of human genetic diversity, the majority of our species' evolutionary history remained in Africa. In a very real sense, we're all Africans carrying within ourselves the legacy of those long millennia when our entire species called a single continent home. As we prepare to explore what finally allowed humans to break free from their African cradle, it's important to remember that this wasn't an escape from prison, but a graduation from university. Africa had been humanity's teacher, providing the challenges and opportunities that shaped our evolution. The continent's diverse environments had honed our adaptability. Its climatic variability had selected for flexibility and innovation. Its megafauna had shaped our cooperative hunting strategies. Its resources had supported the population growth and cultural development necessary for successful expansion. The story of humanity's confinement to Africa is not one of limitation, but of preparation. Every generation that lived and died without seeing beyond the horizon was contributing to the accumulated knowledge and genetic heritage that would eventually enable their descendants to walk on every continent, sail every ocean, and ultimately leave footprints on another world entirely. They couldn't have known the role they were playing in this grand drama, couldn't have imagined the future that their patient endurance was making possible. In the genetic code of every human alive today, in the languages we speak, in the stories we tell, in the art we create, we carry the legacy of those 200,000 years of African confinement. We are the children of those who waited, who endured, who slowly, patiently, generation by generation, built the cognitive and cultural tools that would eventually unlock the cage, not a cage of bars and walls, but of deserts and seas, of climate and competition, of the limitations of mind and culture that had to be overcome before humanity could claim its destiny as a global species. The stage was now set for one of the most remarkable events in the history of life on Earth. The cognitive revolution was about to begin, and with it would come the keys that would finally unlock the doors of Africa. The descendants of those patient African ancestors were about to embark on a journey that would take them to the ends of the earth and beyond. But that transformation, that unlocking, that great adventure was still to come. For now, at the end of this first part of our story, humanity remained in its cradle, gathering strength for the leap into the unknown that would change everything. The tools were sharpening, the minds were quickening, the climate was shifting. The barriers that had held humanity in Africa for 200,000 years were about to fall, but not yet, not quite yet. First would come crisis, transformation, and a cognitive revolution that would fundamentally change what it meant to be human. The greatest journey in the history of our species was about to begin, but it would not be easy, and it would not be without cost. The story of how humanity finally broke free from Africa, of what unlocked the cage and set us free to inherit the earth, is a tale of catastrophe and triumph, of near extinction and ultimate success. Part 2. The Unlocking. The Earth itself was about to become an active participant in our story. Around 75,000 years ago, on an island in what is now Indonesia, a mountain began to stir. Toba was not just any volcano, but what geologists call a supervolcano, a sleeping giant that had been gathering pressure for hundreds of thousands of years. When it finally erupted, it was with a violence that defies comprehension. The explosion was heard thousands of miles away. The ash column rose perhaps 25 miles into the atmosphere, punching through the stratosphere and spreading a veil of particles around the entire planet. In a matter of days, what had been a tropical paradise became a wasteland buried under feet of ash. But the local devastation was just the beginning. The Toba eruption ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, that's enough to bury the entire United States under 8 inches of ash. But the ash was only part of the problem. The sulfur dioxide released by the eruption combined with water in the atmosphere to form sulfuric acid aerosols, tiny droplets that reflected sunlight back into space. The result was what scientists call a volcanic winter. Global temperatures plummeted by perhaps 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. In some regions, the cooling may have been even more severe. The monsoons failed, forests died. The tropical paradise that had nurtured early humans turned hostile, almost overnight. For the humans living 75,000 years ago, the Toba eruption must have seemed like the end of the world. The sun, when visible at all through the volcanic haze, would have appeared dim and red. Plants withered in the reduced sunlight and cold. Animals died or migrated in search of food. For humans dependent on gathering plants and hunting animals, it was a catastrophe beyond imagination. The archaeological record from this period shows a dramatic reduction in the number of human sites, suggesting a massive population decline. Some geneticists have proposed that the human population may have dropped to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 individuals worldwide, though this remains controversial. This population bottleneck, if it occurred, would have had profound effects on human evolution. Small populations experience what geneticists call drift, random changes in gene frequencies that can cause rare variants to become common, or common variants to disappear entirely. In a large population, harmful mutations are quickly eliminated by natural selection, while beneficial mutations slowly spread. But in a small population, chance plays a larger role. A beneficial mutation might disappear simply because its carrier died without offspring, while a neutral or even slightly harmful mutation might spread simply by luck. But catastrophe can also be opportunity. The harsh conditions following the Toba eruption would have created intense selection pressure for intelligence, cooperation, and innovation. Groups that could work together more effectively, that could communicate more clearly, that could innovate solutions to new problems, would have been more likely to survive. The cognitive abilities that had been slowly developing over hundreds of thousands of years were suddenly put to the ultimate test. Those who passed that test became the ancestors of all humans alive today. The volcanic winter lasted perhaps 6 to 10 years, but its effects persisted much longer. The global cooling triggered by Toba may have contributed to the onset of a particularly severe phase of the Ice Age that was already underway. Sea levels dropped as more water became locked in glaciers. Deserts expanded as rainfall patterns shifted. The Sahara, which had briefly been green during a warm period around 120,000 years ago, became even more arid than before. The corridors out of Africa, already narrow, became even more restricted. Yet paradoxically, these harsh conditions may have created new opportunities for human expansion. The drop in sea levels exposed vast areas of continental shelf that are now underwater. The Persian Gulf became a fertile river valley. The Red Sea narrowed to a series of salt lakes that could be crossed on foot. Island chains became peninsulas, creating land bridges that hadn't existed for tens of thousands of years. The very catastrophe that nearly drove humans extinct may have also opened new pathways for migration. But environmental changes alone cannot explain the dramatic expansion that was about to begin. Something had changed in the humans themselves. The archaeological record from the period immediately following Toba shows a fluorescence of new technologies and behaviors. Suddenly we see sophisticated new tool types appearing and spreading rapidly across vast distances. We see evidence for long-distance trade networks, with materials being transported hundreds of miles from their sources. We see an explosion of symbolic behavior, with art, jewelry, and decorated objects becoming common rather than exceptional. This transformation has been called the cognitive revolution, though revolution might be too strong a word for what was likely a gradual process that took place over thousands of years. But something fundamental did change in the way humans thought and behaved. The key innovation may have been fully modern language, with its infinite capacity for expression and its ability to convey abstract concepts. Or it might have been a change in social organization, allowing larger groups to cooperate effectively. Or perhaps it was a cultural innovation, a new way of teaching and learning that allowed knowledge to accumulate more rapidly. Whatever the specific cause, the effects were dramatic. Humans began to behave in ways that were qualitatively different from anything seen before. They began to create what archaeologists call cumulative culture, where innovations build on previous innovations in an accelerating spiral of complexity. A simple improvement in stone tool making might lead to better hunting success, which might support a larger population, which might lead to more innovation, which might enable expansion into new territories, which might expose humans to new materials and challenges, spurring further innovation. The genetic evidence suggests that it was during this period, roughly 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, that the ancestors of all non-African peoples left Africa. This wasn't a mass exodus, but rather a gradual expansion of small groups, perhaps just a few hundred individuals initially, who crossed from Africa into Arabia. These pioneers carried with them not just their genes, but also their languages, their technologies, and their capacity for culture. They were not fleeing Africa, but rather following opportunities, perhaps tracking game animals, following seasonal resources, or simply exploring new territories. The route these early migrants took has been a subject of intense scientific debate. The northern route through the Sinai Peninsula would have been the most obvious, connecting Africa directly to Asia. But during the Ice Age, with the Sahara in one of its hyper-arid phases, this route may have been blocked by desert. The southern route, across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the southern end of the Red Sea, seems more likely. During periods of low sea level, this strait narrows to just a few miles, and island hopping would have been possible with simple rafts or boats. The fact that humans could cross water barriers at all is itself remarkable, and speaks to their enhanced cognitive abilities. Building a raft or boat, even a simple one, requires planning, cooperation, and the ability to imagine something that doesn't yet exist. You need to select appropriate materials, understand how they'll behave in water, and work together to construct something that no single individual could make alone. The first humans to cross the Bab el-Mandeb Strait were not just walking into new territory, they were sailing into it, demonstrating a level of technological sophistication that earlier humans had not achieved. Once in Arabia, these pioneers found themselves in a world that was both familiar and alien. The climate was similar to parts of Africa, but the specific plants and animals were different. The techniques that had worked in Africa needed to be adapted to new circumstances, but humans had become masters of adaptation. Their large brains, their capacity for innovation, and their ability to share knowledge through language allowed them to quickly learn to exploit new resources. Shell middens along the ancient coastlines of Arabia show that these early migrants were adept at harvesting marine resources, perhaps supplementing their diet with fish and shellfish as they moved along the coast. The speed of the subsequent expansion was remarkable. Within perhaps 10,000 years, humans had spread across Asia and into Australia. This might seem slow by modern standards, but it represents an average expansion of several miles per year, a breathtaking pace for people travelling on foot with no maps, no knowledge of what lay ahead, and no supply lines to fall back on. Each generation pushed a little further into the unknown, following coastlines and rivers, crossing mountains and deserts, adapting to new environments as they went. The key to this rapid expansion was not just biological, but cultural. These humans carried with them a package of technologies and behaviours that allowed them to adapt quickly to new environments. They had projectile weapons that allowed them to hunt unfamiliar animals. They had technologies for making clothing and shelter that could be adapted to different climates. They had social structures that enabled cooperation and knowledge sharing. Most importantly, they had language that allowed them to rapidly transmit information about new resources and dangers. The genetic evidence tells us that these expanding populations remained small for many generations. The ancestors of all non-African peoples may have numbered just a few thousand individuals as they spread across Asia. This small population size meant that genetic drift continued to play a role in human evolution. Random mutations that arose in these small groups could quickly become fixed in the population. This is why non-African populations show less genetic diversity than African populations. They all descend from a small founding group that carried only a fraction of African genetic diversity with them. As humans spread across Asia, they encountered other human species that had left Africa hundreds of thousands of years earlier. Neanderthals occupied Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans, a species known mainly from genetic evidence, lived in Eastern Asia. These were not primitive brutes, but sophisticated humans with large brains, complex technologies, and their own cultures. The encounter between modern humans and these other human species was one of the most remarkable events in our evolutionary history. For a long time, scientists believed that modern humans simply replaced these other species, outcompeting them without interbreeding. But genetic evidence has revealed a more complex story. All non-African humans carry small amounts of Neanderthal DNA, typically 1 to 4% of their genome. People from Melanesia and Australia carry additional DNA from Denisovans. This tells us that when modern humans encountered these other species, they didn't just fight or avoid each other, they interbred, producing hybrid offspring that survived and contributed to modern human populations. These hybridization events were probably rare, and the hybrid offspring may have been less fertile than pure species offspring. But they happened often enough to leave a permanent mark on our genome. The Neanderthal and Denisovan genes that persist in modern populations weren't random. They were genes that provided advantages in non-African environments. Genes affecting the immune system, helping to fight off unfamiliar pathogens. Genes affecting metabolism, helping to process different foods or survive in cold climates. Genes affecting skin and hair, providing better protection against UV radiation at high latitudes. In a sense, modern humans didn't just replace Neanderthals and Denisovans, we absorbed them. Their genes live on in us, a testament to the complex history of human migration and interaction. Every non-African person alive today is part Neanderthal, carrying within their cells the legacy of those ancient encounters between different human species. We are not pure Homo sapiens, but rather a mixture, a hybrid species that combines the innovations of African Homo sapiens with the adaptations of Eurasian humans who had been evolving separately for hundreds of thousands of years. The expansion of modern humans wasn't uniform or continuous. It proceeded in pulses, with rapid expansions followed by periods of consolidation. Climate played a major role in determining when and where humans could expand. During warm periods, forests expanded and deserts shrank, opening new corridors for movement. During cold periods, ice sheets blocked some routes while falling sea levels opened others. Humans had to be opportunistic, taking advantage of favourable conditions when they arose. The colonisation of Australia, which occurred at least 65,000 years ago, represents one of the most remarkable achievements of early modern humans. To reach Australia from Asia required crossing at least 60 miles of open ocean, even when sea levels were at their lowest. This wasn't something that could be done accidentally, by clinging to floating logs or being swept out to sea. It required deliberate maritime technology, boats capable of carrying families and supplies across stretches of water where land was not visible. The humans who first set foot on Australian shores encountered a world unlike anything their ancestors had known. Giant marsupials roamed the landscape, including wombats the size of hippos and carnivorous kangaroos. Giant monitor lizards, larger than any living today, hunted in the outback. Flightless birds twice the height of humans strode across the plains. This megafauna had evolved in isolation for millions of years, without exposure to human hunters. They had no fear of these strange new bipedal predators, a naivety that would prove fatal. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, most of Australia's megafauna had gone extinct. The exact cause remains debated, with climate change and human hunting both likely playing roles. But the pattern would be repeated wherever humans arrived in previously uninhabited lands. The megafauna of Europe, Asia, and eventually the Americas would suffer similar fates. Humans had become such effective predators that large animals that had survived millions of years of evolution couldn't survive their first encounter with our species. The success of human expansion wasn't just due to our effectiveness as hunters, but also our flexibility as omnivores. Humans could eat almost anything, from seeds and roots to meat and marrow. This dietary flexibility allowed us to survive in environments where specialized feeders would starve. In the Arctic, humans learned to survive almost entirely on meat and fish. In tropical forests, they subsisted mainly on plants. In coastal areas, they harvested the bounty of the sea. No other large mammal has ever demonstrated such dietary flexibility. But perhaps the most important factor in human success was our capacity for culture. Unlike genetic evolution, which proceeds slowly over thousands of generations, cultural evolution can happen within a single generation. A clever innovation by one individual can be adopted by an entire group almost immediately. Knowledge accumulates, building on itself, creating an ever-expanding toolkit for survival. This cultural evolution allowed humans to adapt to new environments far more quickly than biological evolution alone would permit. The development of clothing provides a perfect example of cultural adaptation. Humans evolved in tropical Africa, where clothing wasn't necessary for survival, but as they moved into colder climates, they needed protection from the elements. The invention of clothing, probably initially simple animal skins draped over the body, allowed humans to survive in climates that would otherwise have been lethal. Over time, clothing technology became more sophisticated, with tailored garments, multiple layers, and specialized items for different weather conditions. The genetic evidence for when humans began wearing clothing comes from an unexpected source: lice. Body lice, which live in clothing rather than on hair, diverged from head lice around 170,000 years ago, suggesting that humans have been wearing clothing for at least that long. But clothing technology really flourished after humans left Africa. Needles made from bone, appearing in the archaeological record around 40,000 years ago, allowed for the creation of fitted garments that provided better protection from cold. The development of weaving, perhaps 20,000 years ago, allowed for even more sophisticated clothing made from plant fibers. Fire was another crucial technology that enabled human expansion. While the controlled use of fire dates back perhaps 1,000,000 years, long before modern humans evolved, the ways humans used fire became increasingly sophisticated over time. Fire provided warmth in cold climates, protection from predators, a way to cook food that made it more digestible and safer to eat, and light that extended the usable hours of the day. But beyond these practical uses, fire also served social functions. The campfire became the center of social life, the place where stories were told, knowledge was transmitted, and social bonds were strengthened. The control of fire also allowed humans to actively modify their environment in ways no other species could. Through controlled burning, humans could clear forests, encourage the growth of certain plants, and drive game animals. This landscape management, practiced by indigenous peoples worldwide, created mosaics of different habitats that increased biodiversity and resource availability. Humans weren't just adapting to environments, they were actively shaping them to better meet their needs. Language, that invisible technology that leaves no archaeological trace, was perhaps the most important factor in human expansion. Language allowed for the rapid transmission of information between individuals and across generations. A hunter could describe the behavior of unfamiliar prey to others who had never seen it. A gatherer could explain which plants were edible and which were poisonous. Navigation techniques, seasonal patterns, and danger warnings could all be shared through language. This meant that each individual didn't have to learn everything through personal experience. They could benefit from the accumulated knowledge of their entire group. But language did more than just transmit practical information. It allowed humans to create shared narratives that bound groups together. Creation myths, ancestor stories, and tribal histories created a sense of shared identity that enabled cooperation on a scale no other species had achieved. These narratives could motivate people to sacrifice for the group, to follow leaders, to maintain traditions even when their practical value wasn't immediately apparent. The stories people told around those ancient campfires weren't just entertainment, they were the glue that held societies together. The archaeological evidence for symbolic behavior explodes after the cognitive revolution. Suddenly, we see cave paintings that demonstrate not just artistic skill, but also deep understanding of animal behavior and anatomy. The paintings in Chauvet Cave in France, dating to around 35,000 years ago, show lions, horses, and rhinos, rendered with a naturalistic skill that wouldn't be equaled until the Renaissance. These weren't crude stick figures, but sophisticated artworks that required planning, skill, and a deep aesthetic sense. Musical instruments also appear in the archaeological record around this time. Flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory, dating to around 40,000 years ago, show that music was important enough to these early humans that they invested considerable effort in creating instruments. Music, like language, leaves little archaeological trace, but its universality in human cultures suggests it played an important role in human society from very early times. Perhaps music helped coordinate group activities, strengthened social bonds, or played a role in ritual and ceremony. Personal ornamentation became increasingly elaborate during this period. Beads made from shells, teeth, and stones were strung into necklaces and bracelets. Clothing was decorated with sewn-on ornaments. Bodies were painted with pigments. These decorations would have communicated information about the wearer's identity, status, and group affiliation. They represent an early form of information technology, allowing people to communicate complex social information at a glance. Trade networks expanded dramatically during this period. Materials like high-quality stone for tools, shells for decoration, and pigments for painting were transported hundreds or even thousands of miles from their sources. This long-distance trade required not just the physical ability to transport goods, but also social mechanisms for establishing trust and reciprocity between groups. The existence of trade networks shows that humans weren't living in isolated bands, but were part of larger social networks that spanned vast distances. The expansion of humans across the globe wasn't a single event, but thousands of small journeys, each building on the last. A group might move just a few miles to follow migrating animals or find better foraging grounds. Over generations, these small movements added up to vast migrations. Children grew up in lands their grandparents had never seen. Each generation pushed a little further into the unknown, carrying with them the accumulated knowledge of their ancestors, while adding their own discoveries to the human toolkit. Climate continued to play a crucial role in determining when and where humans could expand. The last glacial maximum, which peaked around 20,000 years ago, saw ice sheets covering much of northern Europe and North America. Sea levels were nearly 400 feet lower than today, exposing vast areas of continental shelf. The Bering Land Bridge connected Asia to North America, allowing humans to walk into a new continent. But the ice sheets also created barriers, forcing humans to find routes around or through them. The peopling of the Americas represents the final chapter in humanity's initial colonization of the globe. The exact timing remains debated, but most evidence suggests humans entered the Americas at least 15,000 years ago, with some controversial sites suggesting even earlier dates. These first Americans found themselves in a paradise of naive megafauna that had never encountered human hunters. Within a few thousand years, mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and dozens of other large species had gone extinct, likely due to a combination of human hunting and climate change. The speed with which humans colonized the Americas was remarkable. Within perhaps 2,000 years, humans had spread from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, adapting to environments ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest to high-altitude deserts. This rapid expansion was possible only because humans had developed such a flexible and powerful cultural toolkit. The specific technologies varied with the environment, but the underlying capacity for innovation and adaptation was universal. By 10,000 years ago, humans occupied every continent except Antarctica. From the frozen Arctic to the scorching Sahara, from isolated Pacific islands to the high Andes, humans had found ways to survive and thrive in every environment Earth had to offer. The species that had been confined to Africa for 200,000 years had, in just 60,000 years, spread across the entire planet. It was an expansion unprecedented in the history of a life on Earth. But this expansion came at a cost. As humans spread across the globe, we left behind the genetic diversity of our African homeland. Each migration involved a small founding population that carried only a fraction of human genetic diversity with them. The result is that non-African populations, despite their apparent diversity in appearance, are genetically quite similar to each other compared to the deep genetic diversity found within Africa. We traded genetic diversity for geographic diversity, a trade that had both benefits and costs. The diseases that would later plague agricultural societies were largely absent during this period of expansion. Population densities were too low to sustain epidemic diseases, and the constant movement prevented the build-up of waste and parasites that would later plague sedentary populations. But humans carried with them other problems. Violence between groups, evidenced by skeletons with embedded projectile points, shows that warfare existed even in these early societies. Resource, competition, territorial disputes and cultural conflicts led to violence that would only intensify as populations grew. The success of human expansion also came at an ecological cost. Wherever humans arrived, ecosystems that had existed for millions of years were suddenly disrupted. The extinction of megafauna didn't just remove individual species, but transformed entire ecosystems. Large herbivores that had maintained grasslands through grazing were gone. Seed dispersers that had spread plants across landscapes disappeared. Predator-prey relationships that had shaped evolution for millions of years were severed. Humans had become a geological force, reshaping the planet's ecosystems in ways that are still playing out today. Yet for all the disruption humans caused, we also brought something new to the planet. The capacity for conscious reflection on our place in the world. The cave painters of Europe weren't just depicting animals, they were contemplating their relationship with them. The burial practices that became elaborate during this period show humans grappling with mortality and meaning. The myths and stories that bound societies together represented attempts to understand the cosmos and humanity's place within it. The cognitive revolution that enabled human expansion wasn't just about practical problem solving. It was also about the emergence of what we might call the human spirit. The capacity for wonder, for aesthetic appreciation, for moral reasoning, for spiritual experience. The same cognitive abilities that allowed humans to make better tools and navigate new environments also allowed us to create art, music, and poetry. We became not just intelligent animals, but conscious beings capable of contemplating our own existence. As humans spread across the globe, we also began to diversify culturally in ways that would have profound implications for the future. Isolated populations developed their own languages, customs, and beliefs. The single human story that had begun in Africa branched into thousands of different narratives. Technologies that were useful in one environment were forgotten in others where they weren't needed. Cultural innovations arose independently in different places, leading to parallel developments that would later surprise anthropologists. This cultural diversification was accelerated by the variety of environments humans encountered. Arctic hunters developed completely different toolkits and worldviews from tropical forest dwellers. Island populations faced unique challenges that led to unique solutions. Mountain peoples adapted to altitude in ways that lowland populations never needed to. Each environment shaped not just the physical evolution of its inhabitants, but also their cultural evolution, creating the rich tapestry of human diversity we see today. The end of the Ice Age, around 12,000 years ago, marked another turning point in human history. As the climate warmed and stabilized, new opportunities arose. Plants and animals that had been scarce became abundant. Regions that had been uninhabitable became welcoming. The stage was set for the next great transformation in human history, the agricultural revolution. But that's a story for another time. For now, we can marvel at the journey that took a single African species and spread it across the entire planet. Looking back at this remarkable expansion, several factors stand out as crucial to its success. First was the cognitive flexibility that allowed humans to adapt to radically different environments without waiting for biological evolution. Second was the cultural transmission that allowed knowledge to accumulate and spread. Third was the social cooperation that enabled groups to work together on complex tasks. Fourth was the technological innovation that provided tools for survival in challenging environments. And fifth was the sheer persistence and courage of countless individuals who ventured into the unknown. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of human expansion was its inevitability once the cognitive revolution had occurred. Given the human capacity for culture and innovation, expansion across the globe was almost certain to happen. The specific timing and routes might have been different under different circumstances, but the outcome would likely have been the same. Humans were destined to become a global species from the moment we developed the cognitive tools that set us apart from other animals. The legacy of this great expansion lives on in every human alive today. In our genes, we carry the story of the journeys our ancestors took. African genes mixed with Neanderthal genes mixed with Denisovan genes tell the tale of encounters and migrations stretching back tens of thousands of years. In our languages, we hear echoes of ancient tongues spoken around long extinguished campfires. In our myths and legends, we glimpse memories of real events transformed by thousands of years of retelling. The technologies developed during the expansion also laid the foundation for everything that would come later. The stone tools evolved into metal tools, the simple shelters became architecture, the cave paintings became art galleries, the oral traditions became literature, the small bands became civilizations. Every aspect of modern human society has its roots in the innovations of those early pioneers who first ventured out of Africa. The social structures that enabled the expansion also persist in modern forms. The cooperation that allowed small bands to survive in harsh environments evolved into the complex societies we live in today. The trade networks that carried shells and stones across continents became the global economy. The stories that bound tribes together became the national narratives that unite millions. The human capacity for large-scale cooperation, unique among primates, was forged in the crucible of the Great Expansion. As we near the end of our journey through this remarkable period of human history, it's worth reflecting on what it means for us today. We're all descendants of survivors, of people who faced unimaginable challenges and overcame them. We carry within us the legacy of thousands of generations of innovation, adaptation, and persistence. The same cognitive abilities that allowed our ancestors to survive in Ice Age Europe or the Australian desert allow us to solve problems and create solutions today. But we also carry the legacy of the disruption our species has caused. The extinctions that followed human arrival in new lands were just the beginning of our impact on the planet. Today, we are causing what many scientists call the sixth mass extinction, with species disappearing at rates not seen since the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. Climate change caused by human activity threatens to disrupt ecosystems on a scale that dwarfs anything our ancestors caused. We have become a force of nature, capable of reshaping the entire planet. Yet the same cognitive abilities that have allowed us to cause such disruption also give us the unique capacity to recognize and potentially solve these problems. No other species has ever been able to contemplate its own impact on the planet and consciously choose to change its behavior. The consciousness that emerged during the cognitive revolution, the ability to imagine different futures and work toward them, may be the key to ensuring that the human story continues for another 200,000 years. The expansion out of Africa also reminds us of our fundamental unity as a species. Despite the superficial differences in appearance that arose as populations adapted to different environments, we are all one species, all descendants of the same small group of African pioneers. The genetic differences between any two humans from opposite sides of the planet are tiny compared to the differences within other species. We are quite literally one human family, scattered across the globe but united by our common ancestry and our shared humanity. The story of human expansion is also a reminder of the power of migration and cultural exchange. Every great innovation in human history has come from the mixing of different ideas, technologies, and perspectives. The isolation that allowed unique cultures to develop during the expansion was eventually replaced by reconnection as navigation technology improved. The meeting of previously isolated populations led to explosions of innovation that transformed human society. Today's globalized world, where ideas and innovations can spread instantly across the planet, is in some ways a return to the unity our species had when we all lived in Africa. As we drift towards sleep, contemplating this vast sweep of human history, we might wonder what our ancestors would think if they could see us now. Those early humans who first crossed out of Africa, following the coastlines into unknown lands, could never have imagined that their descendants would number in the billions, that we would reshape the entire planet, that we would walk on the moon and send robots to Mars. Yet in some ways, we're not so different from them. We still gather around our modern campfires, the glowing screens that light our faces in the dark. We still tell stories that bind us together. We still push into unknown frontiers, though now they're more likely to be scientific or technological than geographic. The journey that began when the first modern humans emerged in Africa 300,000 years ago continues today. We're still expanding, still exploring, still adapting. The cognitive revolution that unlocked Africa's cage didn't just free us to spread across the planet. It set us on a trajectory that we're still following. Every scientific discovery, every technological innovation, every artistic creation is part of the same story that began when our ancestors first looked at the world and wondered what lay beyond the horizon.